Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our fish webinar this morning. We're so happy that you all could join us today. We've got a really fun lineup for you this morning. We've got two speakers and myself, and we're really looking forward to discussing fish aquaculture and animal welfare with you all today. So I'm going to start with a brief introduction because Compassion World Farming is quite new to South Africa, so I thought I would start with just a brief introduction to the organization, who we are, where we're from, and then we will jump into our presentations. So this is what the agenda looks like. Sorry, I'm just struggling to change. Oh, there we go. So this is what the agenda looks like this morning. We're going to do a brief welcome and introduction, and then we're going to have Santiago Pintos doing our first presentation, followed by Wasim Imam, and then myself. And then we're going to have a really fun panel discussion and Q&A session. And then we're going to round off the morning with some acknowledgements and closure. So as I said, we're going to start with a quick welcome. So we're going to start off the day with saying, what is the history of Compassion in World Farming? So we were founded in October 1967 by a Hampshire dairy farmer. So for those of you who aren't from, or who are from South Africa or not from the UK, that is in the UK. So our head office is in the United Kingdom, and we were started by a local farmer, Peter Roberts, and his wife, Anne. And Peter and Anne became concerned at the growing disconnect between modern agriculture and the well-being of animals and the environment. And they saw that is at odds with sustainability and their personal beliefs, which were founded on compassion. So they started Compassion in World Farming all those years ago and have only grown from strength to strength. And as of this year, we are an organization of over 200 employees spanning the United Kingdom, the European Union, United States of America, Asia, and now we are very happy to say we also have an office in Africa. So if we just look quickly at our current geography, you'll see we have offices all over the globe, but primarily you'll see that they're in the Northern Hemisphere. And we are so very excited that our South African office, which opened in July of last year, is the first office in the Southern Hemisphere. And we are really, really excited that our footprint is growing so significantly, especially into the African continent, where animal welfare issues are not adequately addressed. And we're really looking forward to making a big difference and change to the farming communities in African countries. So what are our change goals? Well, we want to shift from factory farming to regenerative farming. We know that our planet is under stress from the impacts of humans. And we're really looking to shift from very intensive systems to more regenerative farming, where we're working with nature, working with farmers and animals for the better of the planet. We also want to reduce our reliance on animal products and to achieve adoption of positive animal welfare as essential for sustainable climate and nature-friendly food. So we really are about looking at the earth as a whole, and how do we get the most out of our agriculture while still supporting animal welfare and the environment. So we have some really strong values in our organizations. We are champions for animal sentience. We promote compassion, that all farmed animals should be treated with compassion and respect. Advancing humane and sustainable farming. We advocate a pioneering approach to food that benefits farmed animals and thereby people and the planet too. We're focused on impact, so our objective-led campaigns aim to achieve the greatest impact for animals, and we're acting with integrity, so we communicate honestly and in a principled manner. We work on factual and science-based, and our work is based on scientific evidence, sound research, and best practice. And lastly, accountability. We work efficient and measurable use of our resources, reporting openly on our work. So those are our values. So currently we have 5 major campaigns that we run. These are Ban Live Exports, End the Cage Age, End It, which is to bring an end to factory farming, Rethink Fish, and Stop Financing Factory Farming. So these are our global campaigns, and each country has the ability to shape those campaigns to be most effective in their countries. So the reason we're here today is under the campaign of Rethink Fish. So that's a brief introduction to Compassion in World Farming and who we are. As I mentioned, we have a new South African office, which we launched in July of last year. And this is our first webinar or outreach event that we're hosting, and we are really excited that you're all joining us here today. And we would like this session to be quite interactive. So as you'll see on your screen, there is a QR code and a website address, menti.com. So what we're asking is that you guys scan the QR code or go to that web address, and we've got some fun questions that you guys can ask. It's all live. So if you want to scan that QR code or take down that web address with the key code, it'll take you up to that questionnaire. And while you're listening in today, you can go and answer all those questions. And what we'll do is at the Q&A and panel discussion at the end, we'll have a look at those answers and see what you guys come up with. So take a look at that. Wasim will also be sharing this in his presentation, and then you will be able to follow along. So take that QR code. We'll also post it in the chat. And go and give those questions a bit of thought and give them an answer, and we'll come back around to that at the end of the chat or of the presentations. So what we're going to do is we're going to launch into our first presentation, and I'm very excited that we are going to have Santiago Pintos joining us first. So a little bit about Santiago. He joined Compassion World Farming in January this year as the new research manager for aquatic animals. He's recently completed his PhD in biological sciences at the University of Ferreira and the University of Murcia. I hope I pronounced that correctly. I don't think I did. He specializes in aquaculture and aquaponics. His PhD research focused on improving animal welfare assessments by developing non-invasive stress indicators for farmed species. And before that, he earned an MSc in aquaculture and fisheries management from the University of Murcia, and a BSc and MSc in biological sciences from the University of Buenos Aires. So thank you, Santiago. You can now take over and tell us all about global aquaculture.
Hello, Alexis. Thank you so much for the kind introduction. And let me share my screen. Okay. Here. Okay. So, can you see my screen? Can you confirm it?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you so much. So, well, good morning, everyone. Today I will share this presentation with you, which is titled Aquaculture and Animal Welfare, Global Challenges and Opportunities. So to begin with, I would like to provide a definition of aquaculture. So this activity refers to the breeding, rearing, and harvesting of aquatic species for mainly commercial purposes. This includes a wide range of aquatic organisms that can be farmed in considerably different environmental conditions, but also farming systems. So this includes organisms such as fish, shrimp, algae, or even mussels. So over the last 50 years, aquaculture has become one of the fastest growing food industries in the world. And in 2022, for the first time in history, aquaculture has its production of aquatic animals has surpassed that one coming from wild fisheries, reaching a record of 94 million tons of aquatic animals. So this means that just considering fish and crustaceans, up to 1.1 trillion of aquatic animals were farmed in captivity that year. So just to put this into perspective, this is about 95 times the current human population. Okay, so from total aquaculture production, 62% comes from freshwater species. This refers to species farmed in inland environments such as lakes, ponds, rivers, or even indoor in tanks. And this sector is clearly dominated by Asian countries that accounts for approximately 93% of total freshwater production. The key players here are China, India, Vietnam, and Bangladesh, and this sector is mainly dominated by fish and followed by a few crustacean species. In fact, if we look at the most farmed fish species worldwide, you're gonna see that almost all of them are freshwater species, whether considering production in tonnage or considering the number of individuals farmed. So this highlights the crucial role of the freshwater sector within the global and total aquaculture industry. So, with such rapid growth, aquaculture is undeniably shaping the future of global food production. However, all this progress has come at the expense of two fundamental pillars that have been largely overlooked for many, many years. And these are the welfare of those trillions of animals farmed in captivity, but also the environmental sustainability of this production system. And scientific evidence clearly shows that these challenges can no longer be ignored, and its time is necessary to address all of them to ensure the sustainability, the ethical development, and also the future of the industry. So before diving into the challenges and issues associated with different farming systems, I would like to first clarify what animal welfare means. So defining this concept has been and still is a difficult task. However, nowadays, there is a widely accepted scientific consensus that animal welfare not only encompasses physical well-being, as people traditionally believe, this is the basic health and functioning of individuals, but also behavioral needs and the mental well-being of animals, of individuals. This is the affective and emotional states of individuals. So these three dimensions are intrinsically connected and depend on each other. Just to give you an example, if we allow animals to make choices and to express natural behaviors, their mental well-being improves. And this better welfare likely leads to improved animal health and results in a more stable and healthier production. So, on the contrary, if animals are kept in barren environments with limited space and no stimulation, both physical and mental well-being will be compromised, ultimately affecting the production and the quality of the product. So, promoting good welfare is not just an ethical concern, it's also a practical approach to achieving better production outcomes, okay? And the thing is that this mental well-being is a feature likely relevant to what we define as sentient beings. This means these animals that are capable of experiencing feelings and emotion. But for a long time, this mental well-being was thought to be exclusive to humans. But nowadays, we know that a wide range of animals and species do not simply observe and react to stimuli. They also process their experiences neurologically, leading to positive and negative feelings, such as pleasure, joy, or even pain and fear. And among these species, among these animals, fish have been scientifically recognized as sentient animals for decades, with extensive research demonstrating their ability to suffer, to experience pain, to experience fear and distress. And beyond scientific recognition, many countries have also acknowledged this in their legislation. For example, in 2009, the EU officially recognized fish as sentient animals. And in 2022, the UK included fish and all other vertebrates as sentient beings in its legislation. However, as you can imagine, there is still a long way to go, because the reality and the science is showing us that most farm species and most farm animals still don't meet even basic welfare standards throughout the entire farming process. So, from hatcheries to growing tanks, fish are daily exposed to overcrowded conditions, poor water quality, poor handling, risk of disease, air exposure leading to asphyxia, ineffective stunning, and thereby unhuman slaughter. So this highlights a major gap between legislation and actual farming practices that needs to be urgently addressed. And alongside these welfare concerns, the industry must also confront serious environmental challenges. And two of the most pressing issues for freshwater aquaculture are waste management, which often leads to water pollution and eutrophication. I will not enter into details, but these issues are particularly relevant for freshwater aquaculture and freshwater systems where the dilution capacity is lower than in marine environments. And the other environmental issue is related to the environmental footprint, mainly associated with greenhouse gas emissions and the use of key environmental resources such as freshwater and land. Another major concern is the potential transmission of pathogens between farm and wild animals, and also the potential escape of farm animals, especially if we are talking about invasive species such as night tilapia or common carp. And perhaps the most critical issue in the industry is its reliance on high quality feed inputs. The feed production system is one of the main drivers of aquaculture environmental footprint. And I would like to briefly explain why this raises serious environmental and ethical concerns. So just to let you know, every year, up to 2.2 trillion fish are wild caught through fisheries. And around 50% of them are reduced to fish meal and fish oil, key ingredients mainly used for producing aqua feeds. So we are basically catching fish from the wild to feed farm animals in captivity. And this is particularly true for high traffic and carnivorous species such as rainbow trout, Atlantic salmon, or European sea bass, which require high quality and high protein diets to grow in captivity. But the main problem is that approximately 90% of the fish used for fish meal and fish oil could be consumed directly by humans, helping to address all the food security issues worldwide. So just to give you a numeric example to clarify this issue, estimates suggest that around 440 wild-caught fish are necessary to produce just one adult salmon in aquaculture. So these wild fish are reduced to fish meal and fish oil, and together with trimmings and other ingredients, mainly plant ingredients, that may also have a significant environmental impact, for example, soybean meal, we produce the fish feed. But the thing is that despite this high input, around 72% of the protein contained in this feed is lost when converting fish feed into salmon human edible food. And these figures are even worse for other farm species such as rainbow trout or shrimp species. So this highlights how inefficient is this process, because we are using human edible food to feed farm animals, but resulting in a net loss of food that could otherwise be eaten directly by people. So now, having mentioned the key challenges facing aquaculture, I would like to briefly explain the benefits and the drawbacks associated with different farming systems mainly used in the industry. So to understand this, it's important to recognize that farming systems can vary in intensity, depending on the level of external input required for production and depending on the stocking densities. So on the left, we have extensive systems, which require low stocking density and low external input. And on the right, we have intensive systems, which operate with high stocking densities and high input. And this intensity gradient also aligns with welfare potential and sustainability. So as we move towards extensive farming to the left, both welfare potential and sustainability tend to increase. Conversely, intensive farming is strongly associated with poor welfare outcomes and no sustainability. So now I would like to give you some examples of intensive and extensive aquaculture. So a common example of intensive aquaculture could be cage farming, mainly used for carnivorous and marine species such as Atlantic salmon, European sea bream, and European sea bass. But we can also find cages for freshwater species, some of them carnivorous such as rainbow trout, but also omnivorous and herbivores such as Nile tilapia and common carp. So in this system, fish are farmed in floating cages or in net pens placed in natural and open environments. And one of the main concerns of this farming method is that it totally relies on formulated and artificial feeds, so contributing directly to almost all the environmental issues I explained before, such as wild stock reliance, environmental footprint, and water pollution. Additionally, given that stocking densities are high, fish are often exposed to overcrowded conditions and suffer from increased stress levels, but also increased levels of aggression. So this directly leads to high risk of disease and consequently to the use of antibiotics and antimicrobials, so further contributing to water pollution. Furthermore, given that these cages are placed in open and natural environments, as I mentioned, there is also a high risk of fish escapes that can threaten and endanger wild ecosystems and wild populations. And on the top of all of that, these systems require highly trained staff to manage complex infrastructure, to ensure animal health, and to maintain overall productivity. So altogether, these issues result in critical welfare outcomes and serious sustainability concerns. And I would say that the salmon industry could be the best example of this. Our undercover investigations have revealed and raised awareness of the poor welfare conditions in which these animals live, while frequent reports of mass mortalities and fish escapes continue to highlight the issues associated with sea cages. So another intensive farming method would be RAS, recirculating aquaculture systems, which are indoor and land-based farms that use advanced technology to recirculate and reuse water. RAS is often proposed as a more sustainable alternative to traditional farming systems such as cages, as they can be used to farm all the species I mentioned before and more. And the benefits are associated or mainly associated with better waste management and preventing farm fish from interacting with the wild environment. So this certainly helps reduce water pollution, disease transmission, and fish escapes. However, as you can imagine, RAS also presents major challenges. For example, we require huge energy inputs to run these systems, leading to a much higher carbon footprint that varies depending on the species. But just to let you know, we are talking about up to 13 times more carbon dioxide emissions for salmon compared to non-traditional systems. Additionally, in RAS, farming environments are completely barren, negatively affecting fish welfare. And this is necessary to ensure proper water circulation through the system and thereby a stable water quality. Then, to remain profitable, RAS must operate at extremely high stocking densities, so significantly increasing stress and significantly compromising animal welfare. Just to let you know, again, some numbers, we are talking about around 50 kilo of Atlantic salmon per cubic meter in RAS against around 20 kilo in sea cages. So just to let you know how overcrowded this fish can be in RAS. And at the same time, RAS still relies on formulated and artificial feeds, still require highly trained staff. And an important thing is that it's highly dependent on technology. So any system failure in terms of oxygenation or filtration can cause mass mortality events, as frequently seen in the news. So again, if we are talking about intensive farming, there is a strong association with poor welfare outcomes and low sustainability. And that's why these systems are really far away from an ideal solution to farm fish and aquatic animals in captivity. So on the contrary, on the other side, we have extensive systems which operate with low stocking densities and require minimal to no external input. And these systems are based on the principle of minimal intervention in terms of feeding and minimal intervention in terms of management. And so this makes them more sustainable and also better for animal welfare compared to intensive systems. Additionally, extensive farming certainly optimizes the use of resources, requiring minimal input for a considerable output in terms of human edible food. So an example of extensive aquaculture could be pond farming, where omnivorous and herbivorous freshwater and low trophic species such as Nile tilapia, African catfish, common carp, grass carp, or tench can be farmed and can be fed on naturally occurring food sources. So this reduces the waste output and also the reliance on external and artificial feeds. So if stocking densities are kept low, the welfare potential of these systems is really high, as animals may experience reduced stress levels and therefore lower risk of disease. So moreover, these ponds are generally similar to wild habitats, which allows farm fish and farm animals to interact with an enriched environment, exhibit natural behavior, and finally lead to better welfare outcomes. So again, just to let you know, there are real-world examples of extensive and successful systems that have farmed different aquatic species and many aquatic species with low stocking densities and just relying on natural occurring food sources, demonstrating that extensive aquaculture can be sustainable, can be ethical, and can be profitable as well. So other examples of extensive aquaculture can be integrated farming systems where we can farm aquatic animals and crops together. So these systems reduce environmental impact by making a more efficient use of land and use of water. And our well-known, one of the most known examples is rice aquaculture systems, where fish feed on pests and other microorganisms while fertilizing the soil through their waste. So this reduces the need for pesticides and the need for fertilizers while providing certain ecological services, such as improving soil fertility or, for example, natural pest control. So integrated farming systems have been widely recognized as a sustainable alternative for both agriculture and aquaculture, and are even promoted in countries facing serious food security issues. However, we must make sure that these systems also offer and support high welfare potential. Finally, I would also like to mention that shellfish and seaweed aquaculture are great examples of extensive farming, because these systems rely exclusively on natural occurring food sources and take place in natural environments, but providing a lot of ecological services and benefits. Among them, water filtration, carbon dioxide absorption, and habitat creation for other wild species. So, although there is still no scientific consensus about or on the sentience of these shellfish species, such as mussels, oysters, or clams, the welfare potential of these systems is considered really high because the only welfare risk would be limited to the slaughter. To conclude, the key messages I would like to leave you with are, at first of all, that fish are sentient beings, that are animals that can suffer and can feel pain. And that's why, for this reason, aquaculture must ensure that farming practices uphold high welfare standards. This could imply prioritizing extensive systems that guarantee high welfare and no environmental impact. I would also like to say that aquaculture must move away from the expansion of carnivorous species farming, as they have major environmental impacts and also exacerbate food security issues. Instead, the industry can focus on a more sustainable and a more ethical model based on low traffic species and non-fed farming. And finally, none of this can happen without a strong political action and strong policies that ensure that aquaculture becomes a truly ethical, transparent, and science-based industry that ensures both welfare standards and sustainability. So this is all. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Santiago. That was really brilliant and informative and sets the scene so wonderfully for the global perspective on where the global feelings are regarding aquaculture. So thank you so much, and for setting the scene for our next presenter. So just so that you guys know, we will have a Q&A session at the end. We've run out of time. Santiago timed his presentation perfectly there. So there is a chat function and there's the Q&A. So if you have any questions, please feel free to pop your questions into the Q&A and we will come back around to them at the end of the presentations where we'll be able to answer and discuss. So if you have any questions, feel free to pop them in the Q&A now and we'll get back to them at the end of the presentation. So I am incredibly excited to introduce our next speaker, which is Wasim Imam. He is joining us from Ethical Seafood Research. So Wasim is an accomplished aquatic ecologist with over 15 years of experience across the fisheries and aquaculture sector. He holds advanced degrees in applied aquatics ecology, and he's currently completing his doctorate in veterinary medicine at the Complutense University of Madrid on ways to improve the welfare of farmed Nile tilapia during the harvest process in Egypt. So Wasim's going to be talking to us about aquaculture in the African continent, and he's got some really brilliant experience in working with farmers up in Egypt and Kenya on higher welfare aquaculture system. So I'm really looking forward to what he's going to present to us this morning. So Wasim, take it away.
Thank you to Alexis for the introduction and the team of Compassionate World Farming for inviting us to speak at this important event. We're really thrilled to see that Compassionate World Farming are bringing their programs to Africa. There's really no shortage of work to be done to reduce the suffering of farmed animals, and even more so in the case of aquatic animals. So, as Alexis mentioned, I am Wasim Imam. I'm the founder and director of Ethical Seafood Research. I'll talk a bit more about that in a second, but we are a small organization that's working on finding solutions to improve the welfare of aquatic animals and aquaculture. Well, the food system in general, but aquaculture is our focus, and Africa is where a lot of our work takes place, which is why we're really keen to be part of this discussion. So most of our work takes place in Kenya, Tanzania, and in Egypt. That's where I'm originally from, so you'll hear a lot about that. And as you know, Africa is home to some of the most pristine and unique aquatic ecosystems and large biodiversity, with countless endemic species. However, they do tend to be neglected, and even more so in the food system. So we think this is a very timely conversation. Next slide, please. So that should be the Mentimeter. Katie, next slide. Or okay, so that was Mentimeter, but I guess I can now share my screen. That's gonna be messy, but shall we unshare this? And actually, maybe I can do it at the same time. Second. Where's Mentimeter?
Hold the line,
Okay.
I think we'll share the screen with the word cloud on.
Okay. It looked like tilapia, catfish, and underdeveloped were some of the key things that I saw on my site anyway.
Do you maybe want to keep going, Wasima? We can come back to this at the end.
Yeah, sure. Sounds good. Let's do that. Anyway, we had an idea. That's just to kind of get the conversation going. So a brief outline of what I'll talk about today. I'll just introduce you to ESR and what we do. I'll talk about why aquaculture matters, both on a global scale, and then I'll zoom into Africa. I'll look at the scale of the sector, and I'll dive into Egypt in particular in greater detail. I'll talk about how the state of the sector is currently, the aquaculture sector that is, and I'll share some of the findings from our work on the ground there and look at how that can inform activities elsewhere on the continent, such as South Africa, which is what this event is all about. So wait, sorry, are you on outline? Wait, so you're outline. Okay, next slide then. So yeah, okay. So just a brief introduction to who we are. ESR carries out research aimed at improving the lives of aquatic animals. Most of our work has been on Africa so far, but we also have some involvement in projects in India and China, and we're hoping even Nigeria later this year. Our main office is we're a nonprofit in the UK. That's our main registration, but we're also registered as a nonprofit in Spain, in Egypt, and in Kenya. As the name implies, a big part of our focus is research, but we do also carry out a lot of training and so workshops, and we're involved in educational seminars. And where we see opportunities, we also take them and to advocate for policy change. So an example I always give is the one we're involved in Zanzibar. I was just there last month, presenting the aquaculture strategy that we drafted for the government there. So basically, they're transitioning from farming seaweed to finfish in Zanzibar, and they really want to start doing this in the best way possible. So we're helping them incorporate high welfare practices from the outset, which is a approach that we hope to replicate in other places. If that does work for Zanzibar, it would make them a regional leader in responsible production in the Western Indian Ocean region. So yes, most of our work is on the ground projects in the countries that I mentioned, Egypt, Kenya, Tanzania, including Zanzibar, but we do hope to expand to Nigeria later this year. I just want to mention that one of our core values really is about collaboration. So everything I'll talk about today is somehow a result of bringing together various stakeholders and working closely with our partners. We do believe that this is a key to unlocking the various obstacles that are in our place to adopt high welfare practices in aquaculture. Okay, next slide, please. So let's start by asking why aquaculture is important. I think that was already covered a bit in Santiago's talk. But if we look at the scale of global aquaculture, we can see that uh, compared to wild capture fisheries, the global demand for aquatic protein is really only just increasing year on year. So there's various reasons why supply of fish from the wild, I say fish, but I mean in aquatic animals or aquatic protein, has stagnated. So the seafood industry for years now has been pivoting to farming fish and other aquatic animals as an alternative, and the supply of seafood from aquaculture is much larger than the supply from wild capture fisheries, and that's a trend that's set to continue. Um, so, oh, sorry, the next, I should have said next slide. Sorry, this is a slide I meant to be on. So just showing that aquaculture is outstripping wild capture fisheries, basically. So you can go next slide already. And then if we put that in an African context, you can go next slide again. Yeah, exactly. So basically, we see the same trend that, aquaculture is increasing. It's not yet overtaking captured fisheries, well, in the Middle East and North Africa a bit more. But my point here is just that now is an opportune time to start bringing in things like animal welfare considerations into African aquaculture, as a system still has not intensified yet, and before things really take off. So that's our belief there, and we can go next slide. So if we break down African production by country, we see that Egypt really does stand out by far, and it's the largest producer in Africa. So that's why we, ESR, focused a big proportion of our research there and our advocacy work. And that's why I'll talk about our work there for the rest of this talk. And when I say aquaculture, it'll be very obvious right away that I'm actually talking about tilapia in particular. So we can go next slide. Okay, yeah. So, oh, wait. So basically, the majority of okay, we can see that in Egypt, the trend of aquaculture growing, the blue line on the right is higher than fisheries, and that's expected to continue increasing. And on the left, you can see that tilapia makes up the vast majority of Egyptian fish production. Okay, we can go next. And just to give a quick overview of the current state of fish farming in Egypt. When we, sorry, to understand the current state, we need to first understand that most farms are in that one area with the red circle. That's the Nile Delta there in on the left. So that's where most of the farms are. It's quite a small area in some ways. But it's also important to remember that most tilapia farming operations in the country are still fairly low technology, and they consist of mostly basic earthen ponds like the one you can see here on the right. So the point here is that this is quite different to tilapia farming in Asia or South America or even other parts of Africa, where we're already seeing a lot more cages. So we don't really have that much cage farming in Egypt, not officially anyway. As an example of differences between regions, so something like routine vaccination, which is apparently more common in places like Brazil and Thailand, we don't have that in Egypt. So in many ways, the sector is still quite basic, let's say, but that gives us an advantage to introduce welfare interventions, and that's why we think that it's an opportune time to be doing the work that we are doing before things start to intensify, which usually is what happens as we've seen elsewhere. Okay, you can go next slide. And just the point here is to show that Egypt is also looking to export. We've been looking for ages, and the Dutch embassy recently released this study showing how the sector is set for more growth and is likely going to be exporting in the near future. So that's another argument of how growth is happening very fast. And we can, so basically with this immense scale of production and growth, we really feel that animal welfare has to be part of the conversation. So we need to understand where can we improve fish welfare. But to answer that, we needed to get a sense of the current state of practice in the country. Next slide, please. Yeah. Okay, so I'll just talk about the approach that we took for our work in Egypt. We can already go to the next slide. So I'll just mention that for most of the work that we do in Africa and Egypt in particular, we use the One Welfare framework that I assume many of you are familiar with. Just go through it quickly, but basically the premise is that the One Welfare recognizes the connections between animal welfare, human well-being, and environmental sustainability. So there's those three pillars, let's say. And in the case of fish farming, that basically means that improving fish welfare benefits not just the fish, but also farmers' livelihoods, food security, and the ecosystems that support production. So when you're making a case for why fish welfare matters, you have those, arguments you've probably heard before, the ethical one that I think Santiago mentioned, that we have a duty to look after the aquatic animals since they feel pain. And there's obviously economic reasons such as, improving production, improving yield, and even product quality, let's say. And then there's also an environmental aspect through, for example, reducing the use of antimicrobials and the implications it has for the area surrounding that. So yeah, that's the approach that we naturally use in places like Egypt. I always say that, we don't have the same market drivers we have in the global north. So in Egypt, tilapia is a poor man's fish. It's not something you'll see in high-end supermarkets. It's not something you can easily convince and apply pressure to, big players to improve welfare. There has to be other incentives too, and that's what we look for. Actually, tilapia and well, fish in general, but tilapia in particular, are the cheapest source of animal protein for most Egyptian consumers. Our message to all the stakeholders we work with is that good fish welfare is a key component in the sustainable growth of aquaculture sector. It's not something that has to come at the cost of that. Let's say it. Next slide, please. Okay, so for our work in Egypt, we started off by holding some really informative focus group discussions with the key stakeholders and multiple of the major tilapia farming centers. The idea there was to understand, what's the state of play of current practices in farming? What do stakeholders understand about animal welfare? Do they think about these things when they're going about their operations? And one of the great things about these workshops is that we employed a systems thinking approach. So we had representatives from every part of the production chain, not just farmers. We had people from the fish feed world, hatchery operators, market traders, of course, researchers and veterinarians and so on. And we also, if you press next slide, yeah, so we also carried out a survey to complement those workshops. We wanted to dive a bit deeper into those issues. So that was just recently published. The most interesting thing we found from that is that farmers that had attended one of our training sessions in the year before were less likely to encounter issues of poor growth or high mortality in the next cycle. So that was very encouraging. You can go next slide already. Yeah, thank you. So okay, I'm lost now. Yeah. So okay. So to quickly summarize the main things that we learned from these workshops and the follow-on survey. Firstly, hardly anyone in attendance was familiar with the term animal welfare, let alone fish welfare. It's not really a word that translates well in Arabic. So we had to find other ways of transmitting that concept to them. That was a big learning. And then when it comes to fish farming, that's even more foreign. So no one's really used to talking about welfare of fish. We also learned that hardly any farmers actually monitor the quality of the water in their ponds. That's perhaps not surprising because we see that in many other countries, especially in Africa. Now, we also found very few farmers keeping reliable records of practices such as, how many fish are dying, how much they're feeding accurately, and so on. And we found that the way tilapia are harvested is likely to be one of the most stressful parts of the production process. However, at the same time, we saw a lot of many people that were very keen to learn more about animal welfare or fish welfare, which was very encouraging. We also heard many participants express an interest in improving their water quality, so both through monitoring more, but also through the use of additives. And we also saw an interest in how technology can be used to help farmers improve both their record keeping and their harvesting practices. And finally, we learned that there's these mobile harvest teams that go from farm to farm to carry out the harvest, and it tends to be, similar people. So we thought that maybe training those teams in improving harvest practices could be a cost-effective way to reach many farms and improve welfare at scale. So we can go next slide. Yeah. So because of the lack of record keeping that I mentioned, and because workshop participants mentioned interest in adopting new technology, it seemed a really great time to partner with FAI Farms to roll out their tilapia welfare app to Egypt. So we did that last year. FAI Farms are a UK-based food systems consultancy. They're active in not just aquaculture, but poultry and I believe livestock. So a few years ago, they developed this app for monitoring tilapia welfare, which provides quite an easy way for farmers to go in, look, put in some basic measurements about about their farm production. And the app then gives the farmer a welfare score, so they know how their fish are doing, and if it tends to give them recommendations if the score is not so high. So far, we've had really good success with rolling out this app. We've trained hundreds of aquaculture practitioners, both through universities and through partnerships with companies. And that's reached many farmers. So as of today, we've completed well over 4,000 assessments. We've engaged at least 15% of Egypt's entire tilapia sector. And remember, we're one of the largest in the world, so that's quite a big number. And in terms of fish lives, that's basically 260 million individual tilapia that we've reached through just the first year of this partnership. So that was last year. And we hope, of course, to build on that. You can go next slide. Okay, I'm just making sure we're on the same. Okay, cool. And one thing we saw from many of the farms that we were visiting repeatedly, so basically we would be going to the same farm. One of our team, the assessors, would go multiple times over the production cycle, and each time they would complete welfare assessment. And we saw at many farms that the welfare scores were improving. So that's what you're seeing here, these orange arrows, in the chronological order, so from older to newer assessments. So it's actually very encouraging to see that the app is helping farmers improve their welfare scores, which is tied into their production, of course. Okay, we can go next slide. And the success of this project was picked up by a number of key industry outlets last year, so we were really happy about that, of course. Next slide. Okay, so if you remember, I mentioned that hardly anyone, we identified that hardly anyone is monitoring their water quality. Farmers especially. So because of that, we're now running another project with FAI Farms. So that's actually starting next week. And now that Ramadan and Eid, well, maybe yeah, a bit after that, after Eid ends. So this one idea here is a case study to show to farmers why monitoring pond water quality is important. We'll be giving 9 out of 12 farmers water testing kits. We will train them on how to use them. We'll check in with them weekly, and we will to make sure that they're frequently recording their measurements in the app, and then based on those readings, someone from our team will give them feedback and tell them, provide corrective measures if they need. So we'll do this throughout the entire production cycle, and at the end, we'll look at whether there was any difference in productivity or in welfare scores between the farms that had access to and those that didn't have access to water testing kits. Okay, we can go next slide. And as I mentioned a couple of slides ago, because our preliminary work showed that the harvest process was particularly stressful, we felt that this was somewhere where an intervention could be potentially impactful. So I just want to show you a few seconds of this video. If you press next, it should play the video, but hopefully with no sound, so it doesn't deafen everyone. I guess the video, there we go. So yeah, I just wanted to show you, why the harvest process is likely to be quite stressful to the fish. So our main idea was to bring in pre-slaughter electrical stunning, but as we were carrying out the preliminary work, we found that we actually have a lot of work to do in order to improve all these other steps that lead up to that. So, just talking about humane slaughter is easy, but easy to say that, but when you actually come to implement it, there's a lot of things you have to get right. So that's feed withdrawal, crowding, removal from water. And we even found that having enough access to ice is not always guaranteed. So if you're using ice as a post-stunning method of slaughter, that can be tricky. So that's our focus for the coming month. We're looking at how to improve the harvest process. Okay, we can go next slide. So to conclude, it's clear that aquaculture in Africa, in particular freshwater aquaculture, since that's most of what is taking place currently, it's a sector that's growing fast. And of course, many governments in Africa are trying to capitalize on that, what they call the blue economy. So that growth comes with great promise for creating jobs, livelihood improvement, and increasing access to nutrition. But such a fast pace of growth also comes with concerns. So, there's sustainability issues, which are many, but from our perspective, obviously, we're most concerned with animal welfare. And it's just basically important to keep that in mind as these systems intensify, which is what tends to take place, what we've seen in other places. And as you've seen in Egypt, we found that there's a general lack of familiarity with the concept of animal welfare. So that tells us there's a lot of work to do there to continue training. And we know that our training is impactful, so from the study that we published, so that encourages to continue that. I don't think this is a unique finding to Egypt. We also had similar findings in Kenya, but I haven't talked about that here at all. And I imagine South Africa as well. But you'll find not that many people are familiar with the concept of fish welfare or even animal welfare in some sectors. And through our collaboration with FAI in Egypt and now in Kenya, we've demonstrated that the FAI Tilapia Welfare app can be effective in helping farmers improve both production and welfare. I want to put the link in the chat. Maybe I can just here to the app very quickly if you want to learn more about FAI and their app and work. But we've also seen that things like monitoring water quality, harvesting fish, and the slaughter of them these are all areas that need improvement, both in Egypt and likely elsewhere in Africa. So I believe that many of the lessons that I've shared here can be useful for implementing best practices in South Africa, hopefully before the sector starts to really take off. Next slide. Yeah, so I just wanted to finish by emphasizing that the power of partnerships is really, you can't underestimate how crucial partnerships are for advancing farm fish welfare. I really like this diagram that Fish Ether Group have developed because it shows how fish are at the center of a wide range of stakeholders, from consumers, producers, researchers, and policymakers. And given the wide variety of challenges that I mentioned during my talk, the only way we can achieve improved fish welfare in aquaculture is by collaborating between all of these stakeholders and more. And you can go next slide. Oh, there is no next slide. Okay, anyway, yep, that's it. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Wasim. That was very, very informative and really nice to see that Africa is starting to find its place in, agricultural world, and welfare is improving. So thank you so much for that, Wasim. There are a few questions, but we'll keep those towards the end. And then if I see that the Menti slides, it's still stuck on the first one. So if you can open that up, then people can start answering the other questions, if that's possible.
Shall we do that now as a group?
Yeah.
Okay,
Well,
so
no, because I just want you to open it up because I'm stuck on it. Please wait for the presenter to change slides on the Menti. So we'll still do that at the end, but then if you can just open that up and then people can start answering those questions if they want.
Okay.
Cool. All right, everyone. So I'm up next. So I'm going to be talking about, let's get that up. So freshwater aquaculture and food security in South Africa. So that's where my office is based. So we will take a little bit of a focus to South Africa. So yes, we're talking about, fish aquaculture and fish welfare in Africa, but we're going to bring a little bit home to South Africa. So just a little bit of history for the inland aquaculture industry in South Africa. It started around the 1980s and was primarily for trout sport fishing. So trout were brought into the country and the fish was stocked into rivers, mostly in the Western Cape and the KZN, where water was cold enough for the fish to survive. But unfortunately, these are carnivorous fish, and they did quite a number on the native fish and invertebrate populations. So after many decades of fish farming or trout fishing in rivers in South Africa, there was legislation put in place that would limit this. But there are still many rivers in South Africa where trout are free and roaming, and you can go and fish them. But the first permanent trout hatchery was in the Jonkershoek Valley in Stellenbosch in 1984, and that was done by the then Western Cape Department of Nature Conservation. And the infrastructure is still there, derelict, but it is still there all these years later. And, there are still some trout hatcheries in the country, but that's where the aquaculture industry in South Africa really began. But it is still a very small and young industry in South Africa with quite limited growth. And currently mariculture, which is marine aquaculture, makes up the large proportion of the sector. And that's mostly your abalone, mussel, oysters, and some cob. But the main food fish species produced in South Africa include trout, tilapia, marron, which is a freshwater crayfish, so not a fish, but a freshwater crayfish, and to a small extent, catfish. So that's where we are now. So just having a quick look at those species, you've got the brown trout and the rainbow trout, which are carnivorous, and the African sharp-toothed catfish, which is also a voracious carnivore. And then you've got the Nile tilapia and the Mozambique tilapia, which are detritivores, which you'll find are mostly in those pond systems because they do like to, they do really well in pond systems because they feed on the substrate. And then the marron crayfish, which we spoke about. So if we're just putting South Africa into the context of Africa, these are stats from 2020 on the Africa plant and animal agriculture, and these are the 16 highest producing countries. And you'll see South Africa is sitting all the way down at number 13. And out of Africa, we produce less than 0.5% of Africa's aquaculture products. And you'll see that less than 1,500 metric tons of fish. And you can see it's totally dominated by mollusks. And that's primarily your abalone industry. So there's a really solid and well-functioning abalone industry in South Africa. And you can see aquatic plants. So this is your seaweed. But interestingly, the seaweed is produced mainly to feed to the abalone. So the seaweed is grown at the abalone hatcheries and it is fed to the abalone. So that doesn't really produce food in the sense that it's contributing to the economy. So you can see we really are a very small aquaculture producing country. In Africa and globally, we make up a very, very small percentage. So the South African government has been pushing hard in the last, I would like to say, 10 years into growing the aquaculture industry. And by doing that, they've put a lot of mechanisms, processes, legislation, frameworks in place to start growing the aquaculture industry. So the first of that is Operation Phakisa, which is all about enhancing the ocean's economy. And this initiative aims to fast-track the growth of the aquaculture sector through various initiatives, including the establishment of the Aquaculture Development Fund. And a lot of time and effort was placed into Operation Phakisa and really harnessing the ocean's economy, and aquaculture was a large part of that. We also have the Aquaculture Development and Enhancement Program. So this is a cost-sharing grant program funded by the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition, and that's to stimulate investment into the aquaculture sector. So what it is, it's essentially a cost matching. So if you have X amount of money, they will match that amount to feed into your aquaculture facility. And then there's the Aquaculture Development Bill. So the government has proposed an Aquaculture Development Bill, which was initially promulgated in 2018, but is now just going through a revision, which I'm sure most of you know. And this bill is there to provide a dedicated legal framework for the management and sustainable development of the aquaculture sector. And then there's the Aquaculture Technology Demonstration Center, which is in the Free State, and that aims to help with the development of the freshwater aquaculture sector. So government is really putting mechanisms in place to try and grow the industry and enhance the aquaculture industry in South Africa. But as it stands, the legislation around aquaculture is quite in depth, and these are just a few examples of the main legislative pieces that affects aquaculture. And this is not an exhaustive list. There are also other national laws and regulations, and also a lot of provincial legislation that will impact the aquaculture industry. So the first one is the National Environmental Management Act, and this aims to promote cooperative environmental governance by establishing principles for decision-making on matters affecting the environment, institutions that promote cooperative governance, and procedures for coordinating environmental functions. So that really is about how do we manage the natural environment in South Africa. The next is the Biodiversity Act, which provides for the conservation and sustainable utilization of ecosystems and species. The Alien and Invasive Species Regulations. So trout is an invasive species, as is catfish in certain areas in South Africa, and tilapia. So that really is a legislation that tells you where you can and can't have invasive species, what you need to do with them. And that was really put in place because South Africa is subjected to quite bad invasive species, both aquatic and terrestrial. Then there's the National Water Act, which then speaks to water use licenses and what we can and can't do in water bodies. The Aquaculture Development Bill, which has recently been updated and was out for comment during 2023 and 24. The Infrastructure Development Act, so that is where you can build things for your aquaculture facility. So an interesting point to make here is that the aquaculture industry is the only industry in South Africa that is subject to full EIA authorization. So EIA is Environmental Impact Assessment. Anytime you want to open an aquaculture facility, you have to go through the full environmental authorization route. This isn't the case in other agricultural sectors. For example, if you want to open a chicken farm, you don't have to go through the full EIA process unless you trigger a listed activity. And that might be for your buildings, a water use license. But anytime somebody wants to open an aquaculture facility, they have to go through the full EIA process. So it is a bit restrictive in terms of legislation. But there really are potential benefits to aquaculture in South Africa. As Wasim has shown, there is scope for growth. And although aquaculture is still in its infancy in South Africa, the industry has, so it has the potential to improve the economic status of the country, contributing to the eradication of poverty and malnutrition. So there really is scope. It opens channels for employment, enhances food security, and can be sustainable when done correctly. And with its excellent water quality, stable pH levels, and closely monitored and controlled environments, the quality of land-based farm fish can actually be better than that of both wild and ocean farmed fish. I know there's some stigma attached to eating freshwater fish. People, especially South Africans, say, oh, freshwater fish tastes muddy and dirty, because they often associate the rivers and especially, quite silty rivers as the fish tastes, muddy. And this really isn't the case, is that if you have got a really well-running farming environment, the quality of the fish can actually surpass that of wild caught. So there really are potential benefits to growing the aquaculture industry in South Africa. So what is the role of aquaculture in food security? So Africa currently exceeds the world population growth rate. And populations in Africa are forecast to expand exponentially in the next 30 years. Nobody can deny that. And with food security, an increasingly important issue for the projected 2.4 billion mouths that we are going to have to feed. With there being malnutrition rates in Africa as high as they are already, this is a great concern, is how are we going to feed the nations in the years to come? So with the potentially negative effects of global warming on soil quality of the least prepared continent, agricultural production levels are likely to diminish. So we're not going to be able to rely entirely on terrestrial agricultural systems. And with aquaculture, farmers are able to raise mollusks, fish, algae, and nutritious aquatic plants, such as various types of seaweed, in controlled environments, which are relatively easy to maintain. And indoor and tunnel farm fish can spawn year-round at incredibly rapid rates, which means that supply will always meet demand. So there is scope for aquaculture to enhance food security in African countries. But there are significant challenges, especially in South Africa, when it comes to having an aquaculture facility. There are serious regulatory challenges in terms of legislation. As you saw in the previous slide, there are a host of legislative pieces that one needs to comply with in order to open an aquaculture facility. Unfortunately, you can't just put a facility on your farm and just start farming. It is very, very restrictive and can be very time and costly to get your authorization in place to open up your aquaculture facility. There are also significant startup costs ranging from 70,000 Rand up into the millions, depending on the scale and type of farm that you're wanting to open. So it can be very cost prohibitive for somebody wanting to break into the industry. There are also challenges with training and skills development. Most people at this stage, if they want to go into aquaculture, have to go to university and get a 3-year degree, which can be very challenging and really doesn't open the door to skills development in rural Africa. So what would be really good is to start seeing training and skills development from the ground level up, whether that's by training facilities or mentorship. There are really challenges when it comes to skills development. Very few people are adequately trained to be able to run a successful aquaculture endeavor. Also, the economic viability of operations. These facilities are costly to start up, and you need to make sure that you are getting enough money back to make sure that that system is economically viable. Even if you have seed money, you need to start bringing money in to keep the system going for the long term. So you need to make sure that that economic viability is there. Again, if you're looking at species who might not necessarily be able to well adapt, you have to change water temperatures and pH, and that drives your costing of running that facility up. So really, you need to make sure that the economic viability of those operations is secure. Then if we look at the South African climate, and here we're talking about the environmental and socio-political climate. If we're looking at the environmental climate, not all areas in South Africa are conducive to aquaculture. So I know there was, the CSIR did an assessment on the best places for aquaculture development in South Africa, and they did a really great job of looking at where in the different provinces what species would do well. But also we're looking at socio-political challenges in the South African government. And if we think about, load shedding, a system, a facility that requires continuous water reticulation, if you have load shedding, you now need to start mitigating for those impacts on getting, electricity, or whether it's solar or backup generators, to keep your systems going when things don't go well. There's also a lot of market competitiveness. How are our farmers going to break into the market, whether it's a global market or even just a native market? There is a lot of competitiveness that farmers will need to contend with. And especially small-scale opportunities are very limited. And this is, again, by environment, the market, and costs to break into the industry. And as both my colleagues have spoken about, it's really critical that you maintain high welfare in these systems. And I'm sure some of you would have seen this news article that went around in August last year, is that a government-funded aquaculture facility in Mpumalanga was raided by the NSPCA, and unfortunately, there were massive animal welfare issues on this farm. The government provided the facility to this farmer, and unfortunately, he did not have the knowledge or experience to keep the system going. And as you can see, the fish died, massive eutrophication in the ponds. And unfortunately, this farmer continued to feed his dead fish because he didn't have the skills and training to manage the system effectively. And this is what we don't want to be seeing if we're pushing to grow the aquaculture industry, is that we're giving these really great facilities to farmers, but they aren't capacitated enough to make this business a success. And we've seen this not only in the aquaculture industry, but also in other livestock industries, where government is supporting communities and individuals to grow these farms, but they aren't capacitating them enough sufficiently to make it successful. And a few years down the line, we have situations like this, where there are massive animal welfare issues, and the farmer, through no fault of their own, don't know how to fix the situation. So we know scientific studies have confirmed, and legal bodies in South Africa included, confirmed that fish are sentient, which means they experience pain and stress. And this reinforces the importance of good welfare practices. So the recent shift in aquaculture welfare science recognizes the need to improve animal well-being, not just to reduce suffering. So yes, we don't want to see salmon and trout with those horrible parasites and wounds, but it's not just about reducing the suffering, but it's also about improving the animal's well-being. So for example, when we look at not really cage systems, but the RAS systems, where the fish are literally swimming around in circles in a barren environment. So they're not technically suffering, but their well-being is not being adequately taken care of. And those are things that we need to address in our farming systems. So farm fish species requires species-specific welfare strategies, and making a one-size-fits-all approach isn't all that effective because different species need different approaches. So welfare improvements have traditionally taken a top-down approach driven by certifications and regulation. But real progress happens when welfare is seen not just as a moral obligation, but as a tool to enhance sustainability and productivity. And what we need to do is welfare must move beyond compliance to become an integral part of farm operations. And I think Wasim pointed this out really, really nicely, that when we increase animal welfare, when we train our farmers on good animal welfare, your farm produces better, your farm does well, and your fish do better. So really, it needs to be a core part of our farm operations. So when welfare is positioned as a key driver of fish health, product quality, and optimized production, it can create value for everybody in the supply chain. So better fish welfare is a win-win-win. It has a positive impact on the fish, the farmer, and the consumer. So this begs the question, why are we all here today? Is freshwater aquaculture the answer to food insecurity in Africa? And at this point, we actually need to have a look at the difference between an aquaculture system that is there running as a business to export, produce food. And we've got some really excellent aquaculture facilities in South Africa and some really well-educated, experienced aquaculturists who are very, very passionate about the industry and have got thriving businesses. And on the other hand, we can look at freshwater aquaculture, but from a small scale and community side, where we might want to start pushing and say, let's have aquaculture facilities on a community scale, and we're looking at feeding communities rather than exporting to first world countries. So there really are two sides to the aquaculture industry. The one where we traditionally know is, big hatcheries and export, but also looking at food security at a community level. But essentially, we need to proceed with caution. And I say this because as much as we want to grow the aquaculture industry in Africa, and we want it to be the be-all and end-all and save us with food security, we shouldn't be seeing aquaculture as the silver bullet that is going to save, to ensure food security in Africa. And we say this because there are significant challenges to growing the industry, especially what we've seen in South Africa. The industry is still very small. We haven't seen a lot of growth. And it's because there are huge economic, environmental skills and difficulties in accessing the industry. We don't have enough skilled aquaculturists in South Africa to sustainably grow the industry. And unfortunately, money alone won't address the issues that we are facing, especially when it comes to animal welfare. Well, you have to commend the South African government for wanting to grow the industry and wanting to provide aquaculture facilities to previously disadvantaged communities. Giving them a multi-million rand facility is not a guarantee of success. And what we see time and time again is that unless you are upskilling, training, and supporting these farmers, it will inevitably not result in success. So we can't just throw money at the situation. We need to make sure that we are capacitating and training aquaculturists from the ground up to be able to manage and successfully run these aquaculture facilities. And what we should maybe be doing is looking at community upliftment projects. If we're wanting to talk about securing food security, we maybe need to start looking at financial support, training, mentorship, and long-term technical support of communities that can feed at a community level, rather than looking at pumping millions into large aquaculture facilities and hoping to export or access, the national markets. We might need to look at smaller scale projects where we are uplifting individual communities. So structures that prioritize aquatic foods for domestic consumption over export. Let's feed our communities first before we start exporting to the global north. And this is particularly in areas with high malnutrition rates. If we can capacitate local communities to have a small fish farm that can feed that community, and we have high welfare and these people are trained and capacitated and supported, it would really make a difference in that community's food security. So this can be achieved through policies that support local production and distribution of aquatic foods and measures to reduce trade barriers and increase market access for small-scale producers. And we need policies that support research and development of new technologies for sustainable aquaculture practices. It can also help to increase the availability of aquatic foods. So in conclusion, if we want to help the industry grow and thrive, there needs to be a lot more engagement and practical implementation rather than a lot of more paperwork. It's great that we do studies and assessments, but what we really need to be doing is speaking to the people in the industry, working with industry leaders to grow the industry, get a support system, get skills development and training to young farmers who are wanting to get into aquaculture. Make sure that these systems have got high welfare from the get-go, and these people are trained and capacitated to have successful aquaculture facilities. So we need small-scale farmers that have mentorship and ongoing support via government, via expert and training institutions. And we should be implementing from the ground up. So working with our local communities and farmers to make the industry strong and productive and sustainable. And we need to remember that aquaculture is a deeply complex industry. It isn't just somebody who's got a few chickens and sells the eggs or the meat. These are very, very complex systems that not anybody can just start up. You've got water quality issues, there's funding involved, there's sentient beings who need to be taken care of and ensure that we treat them with the respect that they deserve throughout the value, the chain from hatching to slaughter. So this isn't an industry that anybody can get into without any experience. So I would caution that instead of throwing money and growing the industry very rapidly, which may lead to welfare and sustainability issues, we look long and hard on how we grow this industry sustainably with higher welfare, and we'll be able to feed our nation. So I'm going to end my presentation there, and we're going to now move on to our Q&A session and our little panel discussion. So if Santiago and Wasim can join me with their cameras and off mute. and we'll get you guys into the hot seat. So, Wasim, have we got our Menti questions?
Yes, let me see if I can.
Let's see how that came out.
So I think I'd gone to question 3, but let's start from the beginning. Give me a second. Can you see my screen with a Mentimeter? Is it?
Yes.
Okay, so this is live. So basically, this is what we had 46 responses, and tilapia came out as largest one. We can also see catfish, exploitation, freshwater. So that's the first words that come to mind when people think of aquaculture in Africa, which is quite interesting. And of course, we can share this later. Shall I go next?
Yeah, very interesting.
Cool. So the next one was, how much attention do you think fish welfare currently gets in aquaculture discussions in Africa? Uh, very few people thought a lot, which doesn't surprise us. And most people think just a little bit. Shall I go next? Yeah.
Yeah, so that's very good. That's really nice to see, because clearly aquaculture isn't getting the attention it needs in terms of welfare. And that comes across quite clearly. So that's really nice to see. All right, next.
Right. And oh yeah, this one I might have not given enough time to people, so I could do it now if people want to log in to menti.com.
Okay, so if anybody wants to log in while we start answering the questions, if you want to log back in and start moving on to the next questions, I think there are, how many questions are there, Wasim?
There's like 5, 6 more.
Okay,
Like,
so if you
yeah.
guys want to log on while we're busy answering the questions, then we can come and have a look at that just before we close up. So yeah, you guys have some time while we're busy chatting
So
to answer those questions.
Alexis, I'm just not sure how to go in a way that gives people access to the others, because I'm quite new to Mentimeter. So, okay, there's more responses coming in. But for example, if I go to the next one, I think maybe I can do it on my side as well and see.
Wazim, you just need to leave it open on each one for a few minutes for people to join, and it only shows on their one at a time on their phones.
Okay, so I go back.
We can maybe go through that. If you want to start answering some questions, Alexis, we could leave that open on the screen while you're answering the questions, and people can do it at the same time.
Sure thing. All right. So the first question is from Carl van Heerde, which is a bit of a wall of text. Thank you so much, Carl, for your question. It seems like it might be more of a comment. So I'm going to ask Santiago to answer this question. I'm gonna read it first.
Okay.
So fish feed from fish meal versus human feed. Okay. So simply stating that it could be used for human feed does not address the question as to how it can be shifted. These markets are there for a reason. Simply stating that it can be done does not address how and why it is not done. Okay, then he says on welfare, extensive versus intensive, RAS CO2 footprint. This is entirely dependent on what power source is used to generate that required energy needed to operate such facilities. For example, if renewable sources are used, this picture would be completely changed. And then formulated feed is intrinsically harmful. Again, as with the energy source answer, this is only harmful if done in an unsustainable way. In other words, if the feed is formulated in an unsustainable way, an example would be using insect protein farmed from biological waste, refuse, spoiled food. So in general, saying that only extensive systems should be adopted, you are completely discounting the options of intensive systems. The way forward should not be to discount the solutions, but to address the I can't see the rest of that question.
Yeah, probably to address the unsustainability or something.
Sorry, then he carries on to say another example of intensive systems would also be the use of phages to ensure a healthy biome versus the use of antibiotics. So if you want to comment on that.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Carl, for these thoughtful points. Let me read them again. Well, I will try to go one by one. I agree with almost all of them, and also with the fact that I probably did not deeply address them in the presentation. So at first, regarding fish meal, fish oil, and alternative ingredients, I mostly agree. But the thing is that what we often see is that alternatives ingredients often rely on plant-based ingredients, like soy, for example, as I mentioned in the presentation, which may also carry and have serious environmental impact due to deforestation and also water and land use. That's why, as you perfectly said, the most sustainable solution would be to prioritize these kind of byproducts and trimmings from other food production systems
to encourage the use of circular economy and blue economy principles. So this will not, in my opinion, exacerbate food security issues, and at the same time will be sustainable, as you mentioned. Then regarding the RAS system and the carbon footprint, I completely agree there that the environmental impact directly depends on the energy source. So, I mean, if systems are powered by sustainable and green energies, the picture is completely different, as you mentioned. And I also consider that could be more green and sustainable alternatives to minimize the impact of RAS systems. But my main concern, I think that the main concern of compassion is in terms of welfare, because to make RAS economically viable and profitable, we need to stock fish are really high and extremely high stocking densities, as I show for example, for salmon. These are the current estimates. And indeed, for many species, especially freshwater species, it's not even economically viable. So that's why, while I completely agree and recognize that intensive systems can address most of the environmental issues related, in this case, to RAS systems, from a welfare perspective, it remains, at least in my opinion, extremely challenging to uphold and to ensure really high welfare standards in that condition. And that's why we advocate for an industry model that prioritize, not just focus on that, but prioritize extensive farming, and why not regenerative farming systems that can restore and regenerate all the issues as consequences, ecological consequences that have been endangered mainly by intensive farming systems. So let me check again if I am skipping something. Okay, in general, I'm saying that okay, I think that I try to address all of these points. And thank you so much, because it's a really valuable, these are really valuable points. And I did not, talk about all of them in detail in the presentation. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Santiago. Yeah, I think what's important to realize is that every system has its pros and cons. That, you know, some systems will work really well, other systems won't work as well for certain species. And I think it's important to that, you know, we realize that it's not going to be a one-stop shop for every country, every species. And all we need to do is make sure that, you know, these systems, whatever systems we use, we are treating the animals as best as possible. And finding ways to make these systems as high welfare as possible. Okay, sorry, Santiago, I just want to ask you a question before we move on to Wasim, who seems to be quite busy with his meeting there. You mentioned in your presentation about, I think it was a regenerative farm in Spain.
Yeah.
Would you be able to elaborate a little bit more on that project?
Yeah, sure, of course. Well, the farm I mentioned was called Beta La Palma, and it was located in the south of Spain. I can tell you the full story, because originally in the 80s, this farm was used for cattle farming, but the project finally failed economically and caused serious environmental impact, because this area was essentially a wetland. So in the 90s, a Spanish company bought this land and transformed it into a large-scale aquaculture systems based on a pond design. And this farm totally rely on naturally occurring food, no additional feeds, no fertilizers, and indeed they farm several aquatic species in brackish water, if I'm not wrong. For example, sea bass, sea bream, even common carp, shrimps, and also eels, as far as I remember. So all of them at very, very, very low stocking densities. I remember at the talk where this guy talked about this farm, and it said around 4 kilo per cubic meter. It's really, really low. And so this shift in this farm not only restored the ecological balance of the wetland, but also enhanced biodiversity. And that's why I consider it is, and it was a really good example of extensive farming systems that can be sustainable, ethical, and also profitable, because they have worked for, I think that more than 20 years. And indeed, this farm has been featured by National Geographic, and there is, as I mentioned, a really interesting TED Talk about it. I think that the title is something like how I fell in love with the fish or something like that, I highly recommend to, well, watching it, because it really, I think that it really captures how sustainable aquaculture can look like. So this was an example, yeah, that I use.
Thank you, Santiago. Wasim, can I ask you a question?
Yes, please.
Okay, so this is from one of our attendees. How are you motivating farmers to participate in the app and actually upload data? Getting farmers to engage can be challenging, and I'm wondering how you've addressed that issue.
Yeah, so I saw that actually, and that's a great question. And whoever sent that is absolutely right. Farmer engagement is definitely one of the biggest challenges. We are actually working with a behavioral insight expert to uh, sort of understand what motivates people. So that's another conversation altogether. But we generally take a very practical relationship-based approach. So we work with trusted local partners, people who know the farmers really well, that have strong connections with them. That helps build credibility and trust. But we've also framed the app not just as a welfare tool. That's what I mentioned about, like, it records practices for the farmers, so it helps them improve performance. Gives them instant feedback. It can help with benchmarking. And of course, they can see how they're doing compared to others, which is sometimes motivating for farmers. But we've also kept the process quite, user-friendly and low friction. So now the app is available in Arabic. I hadn't mentioned that, but that obviously helps a lot with that. And we do provide in-person support and training through our on-the-ground team. So that kind of keeps you motivated. So in Kenya, what we're doing is we're working with extension officers. So there are people who are naturally going out to, like, that's part of their mandated role, that they go out to farms regularly. So we've trained them last week, actually. That project only just kicked off. So the idea that when they're going to their farms anyway, they just complete an assessment. It's not adding anything. It might even make their job easier in some ways. That's an approach we're trying. But in Egypt, of course, we're working with vets, we work with aquaculture practitioners, and all kinds of industry reps that are naturally visiting farms. So that is our approach there. But it's a learning process, and we're always adapting as we go. And we're trying to, together with FAI, think about more features that we can bring to the app to keep people engaged. Very good question.
Yeah, and I think what's also quite interesting, well, when you're working with local communities or producers, when they see the benefit for themselves, they're more inclined to cooperate. So I'm sure the farmers do see, okay, I'm now tracking my data, something's gone wrong, I can go back and check. And when they start seeing the value of tracking their productivity, their welfare issues, the water quality, you actually start having a better functioning system. So I've seen that before in welfare and working with communities. And as long when they start seeing the benefit of what you're doing and how they're helping you, you get that buy-in, and it starts spreading around and people start wanting to engage more. So when you start working with producers, working with communities, and you start getting that trust, they really do open up to you and start wanting to work with you because they can see the benefit to themselves, their animals, their productivity. So it's really great work what you guys are doing with them. So really great.
Thank you very much.
Okay, the next question is from Rebecca. She says, could the speakers comment on scientific monitoring of animal welfare risks as to breeding goals aimed at enhancing the fattening performance of fish? Santiago?
Well, yeah, I can try. Yeah, I believe this is a really important point, and indeed there is a strong scientific evidence showing that selected breeding programs for fast growth can lead to increased animal risk. In fish, for example, the best example would be Atlantic salmon, where rapid growth is often correlated with, for example, a higher incidence of skeletal malformations, metabolic disorders, and even increased susceptibility to disease. So, yeah, indeed, these traits can severely compromise both physical health, but also mental well-being. And I think that we have examples not only in aquaculture, we have also clear and real examples from terrestrial farming animals. For example, in broiler chickens, we found the same issues. So thank you, Rebecca, for pointing out this topic. Yeah, there is a lot of scientific evidence stating that in fish species. If you want, I can send a lot of reference by email.
Yeah, I think that's a really, Rebecca, a really great question. Because we do see a lot in terrestrial agriculture, actually anything, if you look at, dog breeding, any type of breeding, when you're breeding for specific traits, if you're selecting stock that has higher productivity, better fattening, you're going to start losing certain other traits. And we've seen that through generations of agriculture, animal breeding, is that when you start selecting for traits, you start losing others, and that can start having animal welfare concerns. If you look at, broiler chickens and, what are they called, Franken chickens or something like that, when you start selecting for higher productivity, you start losing other genetic traits. So it is quite it's all quite an emotive subject. Wasim, I'm going to ask you another question quickly. So when we're talking about, higher welfare systems, does there have to be a trade-off between productivity and profit and higher welfare in aquatic systems?
Yeah, I think I actually kind of touched upon that in my talk a bit when I was saying that, that's the messaging that we work with. So I would say not necessarily. And actually, often in the long term, we find that the opposite is true. So improving welfare, it depends what you mean by improving welfare, right? Is it lower stock density? Is it, bringing environmental enrichment? But sometimes there can be upfront or even humane slaughter, like expensive technology. So sometimes it involves upfront costs, or changes to routines, which can be costly. But, we do find that good welfare usually supports rather than competes with productivity. So also depends how you define productivity. So if you're defining productivity in terms of better market access, then improving welfare is giving you better market access. So it depends how you tie it there, but there are obviously trade-offs in the short term. So if you reduce stocking density, it might give you lower yield, but then you have higher survival. So or less need for antibiotics or other treatments if diseases break out. I mean, outbreak of disease is almost always related to some deterioration of water quality. So, improving water quality doesn't have, which can be a welfare intervention, doesn't have to necessarily involve higher costs. So, yeah, we definitely don't believe that they are not mutually exclusive. Yeah.
Thank you. We have a very interesting question here from somebody who has remained anonymous. Is anyone working on reducing human population growth as a means of reducing the supply-demand problem? I think I'll tackle that one. I don't think we are in a place where we can start telling people that they have to stop, having children. Yes, we know that, population growth is going to be a huge challenge. It already is, especially going to the future. We're going to have to produce significantly more food to start to feed the growing population. So unfortunately, I think eugenic sterilization is still definitely not on the cards for anybody. You can't tell people that, they're not allowed to have children. It's one of their human rights. But what we do need to look at is that we know the population is growing. We know that we're going to have to be able to feed these communities. And instead of saying, well, we have to, well, yeah, we really should stop having children, but we can't tell people that. Is rather, let's look at the food system as a whole. Is the food system as it currently stands working? And the answer is no. And we need to start looking at agricultural practices that will feed our growing population into the future. And that's one of the things that we work on quite a lot is food system change. And a lot of NGOs, even in South Africa, are starting to look at food system change, food security, and how that's impacting animal welfare, and how that animal welfare, does impact food production systems. So to answer your question, no, I don't think anybody's working on decreasing the human population. I think the big thing is we need to reevaluate our agricultural systems and how are we going to change those agricultural systems to be able to feed the growing population in a way that doesn't destroy animal welfare. So how do we support animal welfare, but also keep producing sufficient high quality nutrition for the growing population? Okay, and then I see, how is Compassion World Farming planning to support the awareness regarding animal welfare for governments, consumers, and overall industry in Southern African countries? So that's a really great question, and it's one that quite a few animal welfare organizations are looking at doing. We've got some really passionate animal welfare NGOs in South Africa who work really closely with government producers to start bringing animal welfare concerns to the fore, and we're all a very dedicated bunch. So really, it is just about engaging with government. It's about engaging with industry. It's working with communities into the future. So it's something that we're going to be working on quite closely, and food security is something that is quite close to my heart. So because we are still a very, very new office, I can't give you detailed plans, but just know that we are going to be working very closely with other NGOs, governments, industry, to start bringing animal welfare concerns and food security to the fore. Okay. Rebecca says, thanks very much for your reply, Santiago. I'd be very interested in scientific papers on this issue.
Okay,
I
I can reply here by the chat, right? To send
yeah, if you
my
can give
email.
her your,
Okay, sure.
your email address, or Rebecca, if you can give Santiago your email address, he will be asked that. Be able to then. I see Carl has finished the rest of his comment. So he's really commenting on extensive systems are not always possible. In fact, when considering the urban development trend, we need intensive systems in order to produce agricultural products locally and thus sustainably. So crop miles, also if produced locally, your social resilience is also promoted. The advantages are great. So controlled environments also allow many opportunities to de-risk operations, improve efficiencies, promote welfare if done correctly, improve nutritional density, and increase production per footprint. There's also the advantage of utilizing underutilized land. We must not discount an entire way of farming just because there are problems, but rather actively and practically move to solve those problems and challenges. Carl, I don't think anybody here is going to disagree with you. Yeah, sure. Systems have pros and cons no matter how we look at it. And it really is about taking the systems that we've got and making it the best that it can possibly be. So yeah, I don't think anybody's going to be able to discount any of intensive systems, but we just have to make sure that these systems are managed effectively well with high welfare, where the animals' lives are at the forefront. So thank you very much, Carl, for your comments. We really appreciate the comments that you made. And, you know, even if people don't necessarily agree with the standpoint, and, you know, it's really engaging with everybody, even if they don't necessarily have the same ideas with you, because that's how we move forward. You can't always do at the same, you know, we can't all be on the same page all the time. And it really is about finding systems that work for the country you're in, the community you're in, and making the most out of that and making sure that it's sustainable and higher welfare. So thank you so much, Carl, for your contributions. It really is greatly appreciated.
Thank you.
Okay, so Wasim, I'm going to ask you one little question. So if somebody wanted to start a fish farm, what would your advice be?
Wow. So I always say to people that, you know, we're not in the production and advisory section on that, but you know what you're doing first. As you, of course, you give the example of the farm in South Africa where they didn't know what they're doing. You know, study the situation. Don't expect it to be easy. It's something also you touched upon in your presentation. Many people think, oh yeah, you know, aquaculture is just put some fish in a pond or in a cage, but be aware that there's a lot of technical knowledge that goes into this, and definitely take some sort of training before you're trying it out. And you know, always be monitoring and what you're doing and trying to improve the best practices and freshen up on what you're doing all the time, because technology is changing and our knowledge is changing as well. So, but farming is definitely not something that I have experience with personally.
You've got more experience than Santiago and I. At least you work quite closely with fish farmers, so you're a lot closer to it than I am. So Santiago, I'm going to throw you into the hot seat for one last question.
Okay.
So do you believe freshwater aquaculture can help address global food security issues?
Oh, okay. Yeah, I firmly believe that both freshwater aquaculture and also extensive farming can play a meaningful role in addressing food security issues. And let me explain well, or let me set something. For example, something that I consider that we need to know is that our current global food production systems already produce enough food to feed more than twice global human population. So the problem or the issue is not about productivity, it's not about numbers, I consider that it's about how these resources are distributed and accessible. And that's why I consider that freshwater aquaculture can play a really important role here, because there is a strong correlation between there are many scientific studies showing the correlation between the trophic level of a species and the market price. So I would say that freshwater species are generally low trophic, with all the examples that we show, night tilapia, common carp, tent, and other species. So I think that these species are much more affordable to general population, and that's why freshwater aquaculture can play a really important role in addressing food security challenges. Yeah, this is what I think.
Okay, we've got a really, okay, this is it's a comment, it's not a question, because I really want to go and have a look at the Menti results. But somebody posted that farmers should be represented in conversations like this, and I urge this organization to ensure farmer representation in future webinars. Thank you. Absolutely. Farmers are, these conversations go nowhere if the farmers aren't on board. And I think that is one of the main things that we need to focus on. And that's why Wasim's work has been so important, that he's on the ground working with farmers and producers. They need to have a seat at the table. They should really be having the head seat at the table, because ultimately they are the ones who are producing. They are the ones who are responsible, well, not responsible, but have taken on the challenge of producing food for these growing nations. So farmers should be at the forefront on all of these conversations. And I'm really excited that something that Compassionate World Farming is looking at this year is actually producing farmers' voice reports, and actually speaking and engaging with farmers on these issues. Because without them, you know, you can have policies and laws and legislation and you can throw money at it, but without those farmers, we're dead in the water. So farmers do have to be on the forefront. They have to be engaged. We have to make sure that we are looking after our farmers as much as those farmers are looking after their animals. So thank you so much to whoever that was for raising that point, because that is really, really crucial, that farmers have a very, very big seat at the table when we are having these discussions, because ultimately it affects them the most. Okay, so Wasim, let's have a look at those results on the Menti, because we've got just about 5 minutes left.
Just give me 1 second to find the right part. Okay, so where are we?
So thank you everybody so much for engaging with us in this webinar. It's quite daunting doing these things when we can't see you and we don't really know who we're engaging with. So it's really nice and exciting when we can engage with you on something like the Menti and have your participation, and also asking all of the questions. So thank you everybody so much for engaging and being with us today. It's really been a wonderful couple of hours. So Wasim, why don't you talk us through the results?
So this was the first one that we had, and we already talked about it. That Yep. Let me go next. And then the second one, I think we'd already talked about a little bit. Yeah. Okay,
Yeah.
great. And then this one here, some more people gave responses. So
Okay, so interesting. One word that needed to build, what's needed to build a more sustainable and humane aquaculture sector in Africa: knowledge transfer, great technical and business training and support, welfare, investments, entrepreneurship, technological innovations, government intervention, a robust regulatory framework, compassion, very nice, funding, education, and training. Absolutely. You can see knowledge transfer, knowledge and training really does come out quite highly in these. Okay, should we move on to the next one?
yeah. So the next one is ranking these aquaculture systems from lowest welfare, from highest to lowest. So people seem to think that earthen ponds are the highest welfare, which I would be tempted to agree with. This is there's no real correct answer here, but it's the closest to natural, let's say. And open water cages come in next. So that also would maybe a bit more natural than in pond raceways and what they call grass. So this is quite interesting there.
Yeah,
I agree with this rank.
Yeah, pretty spot on.
You go next.
Yeah.
Let's go next.
So which of these do you think is the biggest fish welfare issue in African aquaculture? People seem to think that lack of awareness or training is the biggest one, which is probably what we're finding as well. And the lack of humane slaughter and the water quality issues. It's true that the what they call harvest process is definitely one of the most stressful parts. So I can see why people thought that. And of course, water quality, you can't talk about aquaculture without talking about that issue. So That's interesting. No one seemed to think that stock density was an
Yeah.
issue, which is usually the first thing you get. I'll go next, yeah?
Yeah.
So, what does a high welfare future for African aquaculture look like?
Well,
Basically, yeah, all of these things. Maybe that was, I made it too easy by putting
yeah.
answers there.
Getting
So,
all the answers, hey?
yeah, exactly. Healthy water, good feed, low stress handling, humane slaughter. We want welfare to be seen as part of performance, not separate. And of course, we want to see things like practical tools used to assess
Mm.
and improve welfare. And we want to see that farmers are empowered and supported by vets, and there's research and policy also supporting that. So apparently, that's what a high welfare future looks like. Well, for us, definitely.
Absolutely. Spot on.
And this is from Alexis' talk. So, is freshwater aquaculture the answer to food insecurity in Africa? It seems that there's
Very non-committal from everyone.
okay.
That's great. I don't think anybody is going to be able to answer that question.
Yeah.
I think even after a 2-hour, as informative and wonderful as this webinar is, I don't think we have the answer to that question.
Sure.
And clearly everybody agrees.
Yeah.
Have you ever seen or used a tool that assess fish welfare on a farm? I think that one maybe we didn't get to it as but anyway,
I'm guessing it's probably going to be no.
yeah,
You
Oh, yeah.
actually track.
yeah. I think after that, we can basically stop there. Yeah.
So interestingly enough, I just want to answer this question. So what is typically seen as an acceptable rate of mortality in freshwater aquaculture? And the answer is 20%.
Yeah, that's like 10 to 20 is sort of seen as
10
normal.
to 20%, which I found quite interesting. I thought it would be a bit lower, but yeah, interesting.
Compared to other food sectors, yeah, animal agriculture, I mean, that's
Yeah.
that's
All right, well, that was very interesting and informative. I hope everybody felt the same way. And amazingly, we are perfectly on time. So
Yeah. 1 minute.
it gives me great pleasure to thank both Santiago and Wasim for their really brilliant presentations. I know even as a fish expert, I learned a lot from that. So thank you so much, both of you, for putting in the time and effort of being here today and entertaining us and answering all our questions. And thank you so much to everybody who joined us this morning. We appreciate that you're here and you've been listening to us and have been engaging with us. And this isn't the end of the conversation. This is just the start of the conversation for welfare and fish welfare in Africa and South Africa. So I see there is one more question from Ivan. So unfortunately, we don't have time to answer it, but I might just ask somebody to answer it in the chat. And we would just like to thank everybody for being here today and entertaining us with your presence. So have a wonderful afternoon and rest of the day, everyone. We look forward to engaging with you further on these issues into the future. And yeah, if there's anything else, you're welcome to reach out to us. So without further ado, goodbye, everyone.